Welcome, everybody, to the Forest Service. You're not all part of the Forest Service, I know that, but both Kerry and I are Forest Service employees, so we're representing here. And that's partly because the Forest Service manages the largest trail system in the country, and our standards are often adopted by partners and state and local agencies. So we're speaking with that background. And once again, my name is Jess, and I am talking to you from the Flathead National Forest in Northwest Montana. I have also worked in California, Colorado, and New Mexico with Kerry, actually. And I'll let him share his locational background.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Hey, everybody, my name is Kerry Wood. I'm the Trails and Wilderness Program Manager on the Cibola National Forest. I'm based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Worked in a couple of other regions, other forests, and also worked for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for many years over in Region 8. So definitely gotten to do trail work in a number of regions and types for sure. And thanks for joining us today.
So what are we going to cover today? We will start with trail fundamentals. What is a trail? And then we will go through the three categories of major trail maintenance. That is tread, drainage, and corridor maintenance. And then we'll follow up with some of the most common structures, and then we'll do a wrap up. And once again, we will do a short question and answer session where we try to address anything that's come up at the end of each of these segments. So feel free to enter into the Q&A box or the chat as desired. And of course, we're talking about trail work. So before we get going, let's talk safety. There will be variation depending on where you are, and the task you're doing. But the basics of trail personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, are boots, hard hat, long sleeve shirt, long pants, gloves, ear pro, and eye pro. And it's worth noting that when I say pro, that is for protection, not professional, though it is professional to protect yourself. And with that, Kerry.
All right, I just want to point out that all of that PPE there looked way too clean. And then I'll just put a quick disclaimer that anybody that's worked in trails for a long time knows that there's just all kinds of stuff you can cover in a presentation. And Jess and I have planned this remotely the best we can. So if you see some hiccups, please give us a pass on that. So, all right, so we're going to talk about trail fundamentals. And kind of the idea behind this was just to give people a basic understanding about trails, trail types. There's all kinds of things you'll see out there, cover a little bit about components and the anatomy of trails. And then, where does trail maintenance fit within those design types or those different situations you'll get into. Next slide. Cool. So one of the common factors, and we all know this, that the trail tread is common throughout anything you'll ever see in terms of what a trail is. So, a trail tread facilitates travel by the approved uses for that trail. And hopefully it's not just by the approved uses, but it also hopefully is designed and maintained in a way that works for the seasons that you anticipate different types of travel. The trail tread can be part of the experience for folks. Sometimes the trail tread condition also can facilitate a different experience, such as scenery and other things are easier to enjoy when you're not having to pay attention so much to the trail tread. But again, sometimes the trail tread is very much part of the experience, thinking about different types of treads you've seen out there, different conditions they're in, and other things about the tread. Largely, we're always looking to ensure that the trail tread is free of hazards, so that folks that are using the trails, can do so safely, or at least with a reasonable expectation of safety, depending on the type of activity that they're doing. And then we also are always trying to make sure that that tread does not contribute to resource or degrading any of other resources. And ideally, maintaining that trail tread requires only minimal maintenance. You know, a lot of the work we do around trails is basically to protect and secure the trail tread. Next slide. So you'll see all kinds of different trails out there. Obviously, you've got, you know, a gravel trail or kind of a gravelish trail tread out in the desert Southwest. Something like this, where you see something built in a, and I'm gonna, of course, not remember what this is called for some reason. Turnpike, there we go. Turnpike in a wet area. That's just because I'm presenting, I guess. You can do the next one. You know, you'll see some interesting trail designs. This one's in the Grand Canyon on the, I believe this is on the Kaibab Trail. And then next one. And then you'll see something pretty extreme like this. This comes out of Region 9 up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Pretty interesting. Obviously not very dissimilar than the other ones that we've seen, but still technically a trail tread, I would guess. And so anyway, we wanted to recognize that there are all kinds of different looking trails out there, different designs, and that, you know, in the amount of time we have today, we obviously cannot cover in depth of every one of them. So when we were kind of talking about our presentation, we kind of decided that we really wanted to be able to present one trail design type that most of us can agree on typically is the more sustainable trail design, and that a lot of things that we talked about from here on out, when we could, we would reference this design and try and use it as a way to kind of make judgments about what you might or might do on other trails that you see. So that trail design is a rolling contour trail. As you can see in these two photos, rolling contour trails tend to be the most sustainable design in most areas. Obviously, you're going to see some variation in different places. But again, when you're trying to assess the type of work you might do on a trail that's there at your feet, sometimes I've always found it helpful to explain what needs to be done in relation to a rolling contour trail, because the elements that make a rolling contour trail sustainable, if you can, folding those elements into the trail you're working on can often, you know, kind of give you the best outcome. You can do the next slide, Jess. Cool. So rolling contour trails kind of center on this idea that for the most part, you're trying to get any water coming onto your trail to kind of sheet across it. That's noted kind of in that drawing on the left. Whereas on the right, you can see that you've got a lot of water focusing on the tread. It's moving a lot of sediment, not a very desirable trail. So again, that rolling contour trail is really centered at trying to make sure that water doesn't stay in the tread, it moves off, and that hopefully doesn't take too much sediment with it. Next slide. Some of the fundamentals that make rolling contour trails, or the elements about a rolling contour trail that makes them sustainable, is first that rolling contour trails are, you know, cut in the Sidehill. There's all kinds of different diagrams that are shown for rolling contour trails or Sidehill trails. And so I've just provided a couple here. The one on the left shows a Sidehill, but shows some other issues that may develop along Sidehill trail. The one in the middle was just a drawing I did to show a very, very just clear parts of a Sidehill trail. So we've got our trail tread. Oftentimes we try and outslope the trail tread by 5%. The width of that tread is going to be dependent on the trail class, trail use, and other factors. That back slope on the backside there, I've often heard people tell constructors to dig that at a 45-degree angle. Usually what we do is we'll build those trails to where it basically it looks like the predominant slope on the hillside. We're really trying to take away a defined edge above the trail. And then one thing I forgot to label at the outside of the tread is that critical edge, and that's something that we'll sometimes talk about. The diagram on the right really just shows varying degrees at which you do a full or a partial bench. Oftentimes we recommend doing full bench trail construction. So that means the tread is fully excavated rather than partially built out of the spoils or the soil that came from within. So that's Sidehill. You can do the next slide. The other thing is that, the rolling contour trails really depend on grade and undulation. Grade, as you can see in the one diagram, shows kind of how you can calculate grade. But, here in the Southwest, I usually try and stick with 8% as kind of my max grade if I possibly can. Obviously, you're going to have areas where it might get steeper. There's definitely places where it's not that steep, but 8% is usually good. I've definitely seen trails at a higher grade that have done okay because they had other elements that were kind of keeping the trail in place. I've seen parts of the Appalachian Trail in Southwest Virginia that are way above that and somehow have survived because they have some other element kind of helping them out. But anyway, grade is something that we really want to pay attention to. How do you determine what grade works best for your trails? I often say, instead of trying to do all the fancy soil tests that some people will recommend, I would say just go look at your existing trails and it'll give you a really good idea about what kind of grades the trails that you're working on in your area can handle. The other part in this one is undulation. So if we were to build a trail from point A to point B and it rose at 8% grade straight through there, we're still going to have a water problem. So we always want to make sure that our trails, a rolling contour trail, has undulation along its alignment. I've also seen it written in some places where recommendations usually are to only undulate trails where it crosses drainages. I don't really find that that matches what works best on trails. There's a table on that right side that kind of talks about frequency or distance between undulations, depending on your soil type. Again, look at your local trails and see, how well it handles the type of trail traffic and the frequency of undulation. All right, Jess, next one. And then the last part is vegetation management along a rolling contour trail. Again, we're going to talk about vegetation management here in a little bit, or Jess is going to do that a little bit more in depth, but just understand that vegetation management along with that Sidehill and grade and undulation all really all play key parts into making sure that your trail traffic stays on the tread that you've provided for them. And so as you look at different trail maintenance tasks on the trail you're at, think about those different components. Is the trail I'm looking at, does it undulate, or is it allowing water to move off right? Is the grade too high? All those different factors. Is there vegetation factors that are pushing people in the wrong direction? All that kind of stuff. But anyway, throughout the presentation, our hope was that we could kind of give an example of what we consider to be one of the better designs, and it would provide a really good way of a reference point to work from. Thanks. Yeah, sure. If anybody has any questions, please let me know.
There's one question in the Q&A box for the two of you. And it's given the high need recently for restoration of fire damaged trails, what are common trail work needed in those conditions over and above, I think, tree removal?
Wow, right before this presentation, I was just sending a report to a ranger about damage. It really depends on the local conditions, at least from my experience. I know here in the Southwest, we'll get our burns and then we'll start getting our monsoon season. And that's usually what puts our fire season to bed. There's a tendency to want to get right out and try and do rehab work right then. Oftentimes I've found that any work you try and do on at least severely burned trails tends to get overridden by sediment and other things that the monsoon provides right afterwards. So it's really going to depend on how much vegetation's around there or not. Certainly, if you can find ways to keep the water from going straight down your trail, there's all kinds of things that you can do. But in some cases, waiting is a good one, first and foremost.
It's also worth considering that not all fire-related maintenance needs are immediately after the fire. Another reason to consider waiting. If you get overstory destruction in a high-intensity fire, in a lot of places, the next round of vegetative growth is really thick and you're going to change your brushing and corridor needs. So you just have to be aware that there are impacts, and those impacts vary depending on where you are.
Great, thanks. There's a couple more in the chat. Is rolling contour instead of water bars the same as rolling grade dips?
Not exactly. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Rolling grade dips are usually something that you would build after construction, whereas rolling contour trails, that undulation comes by virtue of your design rather than things that you build on the trail afterward. But we will talk a little bit about your options related to rolling grade dips and some other options here in a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Kerry. Another one, how important is a clinometer for reroutes of poorly constructed trails or any repair of very eroded areas?
That depends a lot on how good your internal clinometer is. So initially, it is pretty important. Grade makes a big difference. It's important to understand what grade works for your soil type. I can tolerate much higher grades in Northwest Montana because my soil is amazing than I could elsewhere, and I have to know what those targets are and what will or will not work. But yes, having good grades if you're doing reconstruction is crucial. That's part of how you're going to have a sustainable trail with a long lifespan.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to Jess's earlier comment about your internal clinometer. I think if you're just starting out, utilizing a clinometer is a really good thing to do to kind of get that set so that you get the quote I for grade. There's never anything wrong with using one, that's for sure. I also, even though I feel like I have a pretty good eye for it, I will bring a clinometer a lot of times, especially if you're working in thick vegetation where it's really hard to see the ground. Clinometer is really handy in order to get that grade right. And just remember, especially when you're siting out, designing a new trail, that just because you're setting a general grade, remember to get the undulation in your trail, you're going to have to go steeper than that in some areas. So again, that's why I tend to stick with 8, because I'll have undulation there and I'll never have anything that really maxes out above 10 or 12 if I start with an average grade of 8.
Okay, the next question. Did you say you don't cut the back slope to 45 degrees? If yes, what's the reason for that? What about concerns of the uphill debris piling up on that inside edge?
Yeah, so I should be a little clearer. If when in doubt, 45 is great, but really what I try and do is I try and cut my back slope that it conforms with the predominant slope above the trail as much as possible. So it could be 45 degrees, it could be even greater. But really what you're trying to do is from that edge between the tread and the back slope, you really don't want to see another distinct edge above the tread. So that's really kind of what you're trying to do. And so here in the desert Southwest, having that distinct edge tends not to be too much of a problem, but I know from my days working on the Appalachian Trail that if you didn't cut the back slope to the point where you got rid of that edge above, you would often have moisture and then moss and then all kinds of stuff starting to grow at that edge there, and then eventually it would slough off into the trail. So when in doubt, 45 degrees is just fine, but sometimes it's going to be more than that depending on the predominant slope. So it really, your best bet is just to dig that back slope back until you don't see that defined edge between your newly cut back slope and the predominant slope.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for right now. Thanks.
Perfect. So now we will go into a little bit more detail on tread maintenance. And you'll see the 2 pictures of trails that I have up here are both trails on my district. They look very different because they're designed and maintained for different user groups and experiences. The one on the left is smaller, narrower, more intermittent tread. And the one on the right is a pack and saddle trail that is pretty clear and frequently used. and intended to give a more a easier experience in some senses. But even though they don't, or even though they look very different, they're both sustainable trails. We don't need the one on the left to look like the one on the right for it to be sustainable. They both shed water. Neither one damages nearby resources. Neither requires a lot of maintenance. And they both satisfy the needs and desires of their primary users. So not all tread will look the same, and that is okay. So once again, looking at the variety of tread types. Oh, except that my computer is having a moment. Here we go. So once again, the Southwest, gravelly in brush. A turnpike holding tread dry above something wet, typically. Really built up national park system trail designed to accommodate a lot of users in a relatively easy experience. The exact opposite, rungs go, a ladder going up a rock wall, but still tread, still a trail. Or we also have a dirt path through the middle of a talus field. They all look different, and we consider all of them to be our tread, something to be maintained and taken care of. So as I go through the tread section, I will start by listing and explaining some of the common tools used in tread work, and then I'm going to go through some of the most common problems, specifically sloughing, berms, braiding, and ditching. So in terms of tools, these are all tools that I have had on districts where I have worked, and I'm not going to tell you how to use them. You're going to need to work with your local trail managers and actually feel them and touch them. But I will make you familiar with them. I'm also going to say that not every district will have every one of these tools, and not every tool that you will find on a district will be represented here. These are just some of the more common ones. So starting in the top left and then going counterclockwise, we have the McLeod, which is designed for moving brushy material or loose material. It's very good for finishing work. We have the round pointed shovel, which is a digging tool and a good friend of most trail workers. We have the combi tool, which is designed to serve both as a pick breaking up rock and as a hoe breaking up vegetative material, but it has moving parts, which is always a questionable situation. This is a grub hoe. There's a variety of hoes. They're very good for breaking up sod or really rooty vegetative material. There's the cutter mattock, which I personally love. It has a mattock end, which moves a lot of dirt well, and it has a cutting end, which is usually not very sharp, but you can bludgeon roots and assorted other vegetative material to death. Above that, we have the Pulaski, which is the fine-tuned version of the cutter mattock. It has a sharper, more fine-tuned cutting side, which is more like a true axe. And then it's got a grubbing ad side, which is also much lighter. So the axe does a better job of cutting through stuff, but the ad's end is not nearly as able to move the same volume of dirt. And then finally, we've got the pick, and you can have either a straight pick or a pick mattock, and they're really good for moving and breaking up dirt. So now that you've seen the tools, what do we do with them? Let's talk about one of our common trail problems, sloughing. So slough is what happens when dirt travels downhill and hits your trail, and your trail should be relatively flat, and it stops the dirt, and slowly your trail fills in with dirt or slough. And you don't typically address slough the minute that it happens. Often you don't address slough until it's starting to make a pretty narrow trail. But you want to be aware of it, and you want to be aware of how to fix it. So in this case, this is a single track mountain biking trail on my district, and it is getting pretty narrow. We don't want it to be huge, but we also don't want it to be basically a tire wide. You can see with the hoe on there that it is probably 4 to 6 inches wide. And so what we've had is my trail partner went through and she benched it out. Benching is when you re-establish that flat tread by pulling material out of the uphill side and dragging it down and then depositing some of it on the downhill side. And some of it stays in your trail to create new tread that's nice and gently outsloped. So you can see here from that photo of what a perfect Sidehill trail looks like, you can compare it to what my partner did here. You can see her back slope, which is in this case at about 45 degrees, possibly a little bit steeper, but there is no hard upper edge. It kind of gently rolls into the back slope, just like what Kerry was talking about. And then she has a slightly outsloped, wider tread. And in this case, it is meant to be a single track mountain biking trail. So that tread is not 24 or 48 inches. It's more like 12 to 18. But that is what's desired for this trail experience. On a different trail, it will be wider or possibly narrower, but the same principles, the same overall look will still apply. And then you can see the downslope where some of the extra vegetated or material that she pulled out of the hillside is sitting and supporting the under edge of tread. So a nice example of recent trail maintenance. And this is something that doesn't necessarily take a very long time, but can significantly improve the experience and the ability of a trail to successfully shed water. So next we will look at berms. So if you look at this picture, you can see the slough is on the left, on the uphill side of the trail, and then the berm is on the right, on the downhill side of the trail. And what that berm is extra material that has piled up on the downhill side. And the reason that's a problem is because it stops the trail from being outsloped. If you've got that berm there, the water is not going to be able to flow down the hill and then across the trail and off. It will be caught in the trail, potentially either pooling or if it's enough of a water flow starting to flow down the trail and causing erosion issues. So what do? We remove the berm. So berms can be made out of multiple materials. In this case, this is a rock berm. It is a trail that travels through a talus field. And over the years, rocks fall on the trail and then helpful trail workers or public removes the rock from the trail and puts it onto the side of the trail, creating a berm. And a couple of rocks are not a big deal, but over a decade of people just piling rocks, suddenly we have an experience that's not very good. People don't like walking between, knee-deep rocks on both sides, and water's not going to efficiently move off of our trail. So you can see this actually took a decent amount of time to move this much rock and to move it safely so that it didn't just land on the trail below us, because you can see this is a switchback. But we took the time to remove the vast majority of those rocks. And once again, you don't have to move every rock. It's okay if there are occasional obstacles on the side of the trail. Sometimes that helps keep users where we want them, on the trail. But we need to remove enough so that A, there's somewhere to put rock in the future, and B, we actually have that shedding of water that we're looking for. Berms can also be made out of dirt. So in this case, we have a newly constructed pack and saddle trail. And as the horses and new users travel on it, they compress the dirt. And as they compress the dirt in the middle where they're walking, we end up with humps on the sides. So you can see the little red hump that is preventing water from flowing effectively off of the trail and is instead keeping the water in the middle of the trail where it's already getting packed down. So our marvelous berminator here, Russell Berman, came out and he removed that berm from the outside of the trail and pulled it off so that now the water sheds again. This is a very important task. Berms need to be addressed fairly immediately before they become a water problem. Whereas sloughs, you can often wait until you have time to address them. So next up is braiding. Braiding looks different in different places. These are all examples of braiding situations. And so what is braiding? Braiding is when our users are not necessarily staying on the trail. They're starting to deviate and move next to the trail, creating multiple paths. And the thing that you have to ask yourself to go out and do the maintenance is why? Why are they not staying on the trail that you want them to be on? So in this case, it's probably because there are ruts and it's really easy to move side to side. If people, horses, nobody really likes walking, like I said before, in a rut where there is material up the sides of your legs. It just doesn't feel very good. It feels kind of insecure. And so what happens is people tend to keep moving sideways to be on top of the vegetation where it's a slightly nicer walking experience. And somewhere like this, where there is plenty of room to walk, they'll just keep doing it. Sometimes the braiding happens because of mud. This location gets very muddy in the springtime. It holds water. And so instead of staying in the one trail that we originally designated, as it gets wet, people keep moving to the side to get away from that moisture. And they just keep making more and more trails because as they move, that gets wet too. And then in this case, it's an issue of obstructions. The original uphill trail was probably fine, but that rock in front looks like it fell into the trail. And then the ones behind that probably got exposed as stock and people were walking on the trail. So they tried to avoid it by going down below, but there's not a way through the trees down below. So they were going under and then taking this hard left turn to get back up to the main trail. And that wasn't really desirable either. And so you have to come up with the solution that fixes why you have a braiding situation. And in this case, we moved the rocks that were causing obstructions and we actually put them in that lower trail. So now it's obstructed and we are keeping people on the trail we want them to be on. And in general, I like the uphill trail because now I've got a better undulating trail situation. This low point will drain and then we go up and continue to have a nice, well-designed trail that does the things that we want with water. So it is possible to fix braiding. It depends on why you have it though, what your exact solution is. All right, and the next major trail problem that you are likely to see regarding tread is ditching. With ditching, it can be kind of a consistent ditch like we've got on the left. The one in the middle is short, it's barely ditching, but we have a lot of the underlying material starting to punch out, lots of obstructions, rocks and roots. And then on the right, that's a terrible ditch. It is hard to walk in that thing, but the area is so steep that there's not really an alternative. So they just keep using it and making it worse. The tricky thing with ditches is they're hard to fix. They are usually a design problem. The reason you get ditching is you have water running down a trail somewhere that is steeper than your soil type can handle. So solutions, if you're keeping the trail in place, are usually expensive and time consuming. In this case, we have a riprap staircase had to be installed. That has to be done by a pretty experienced crew. Here, we installed, I believe it ended up being 3 steps so that we got up and over those obstructions and made it so that the soil had nowhere to go. It had to stay in place because those steps supported it. And with this one, we built yet again a rock staircase. But all of these solutions are bigger solutions which are typically outside the scope of maintenance. If you have this type of ditching, it's time to be talking to your trails manager or supervisor. So based on the time frame we're on, we have about 1 minute for questions.
Well, we'll try to be quick. The first question, when creating a new trail, how is the type of tread chosen?
So that's actually a great question. I'll plug the next session that I'm teaching in a couple days, which is TMOs for trail dogs. The idea is that we consider users and desired experience, and it is the combination of those factors that leads to a trail specifications and what we're actually looking for a trail to look like. And as long as you're working for the Forest Service, those TMO documents exist and tell you what we're looking for. So you can consult and find out what that is.
Okay, next question. What is the best round point shovel?
Great question. I used to love the fire shovel, but they made them heavy and they're terrible now. There's a pony shovel, which is not bad. I can't remember the name of the manufacturer, but if you Google the pony shovel, you should be able to find it.
I was going to say the best shovel is the one that the fire crew left in the back of their shed.
That's fair too.
All right. The next one is, when are trails designed to be outsloped versus insloped?
It depends on a lot of factors. I'll point it out when we talk about drainage. One of the main factors that you want to know is just kind of your soil type. So the Grand Canyon picture that we've shown a couple times where there's that interior drain with the check dams. In that case, I took that picture after talking with the trail crew there in the Grand Canyon, and they said if we outsloped our trails after the mules and everything else go down, if we got one rain, we would lose the entire trail. And so if the soil type is one in which you're going to lose it very quickly because it has no adhesion, that might be a case in which you need to think about insloping or somehow keeping your tread. But more often than not, outsloping your tread is going to be the better design. But there certainly are some cases where that's a problem. But insloping is a lot of times going to be when your soil type is that you're afraid to lose it.
Okay, great. Next one, does anyone have enough funding to mitigate these problem areas before they get real bad?
Seems like a whole nother session that we need to establish to talk about that.
There is a session on fundraising, I believe, on Friday. So there you go.
Great. Yeah, I mean, our hope always is that, when we're doing this work, that we're doing it in a way that we don't have to come back anytime soon, so that we do have the ability to anticipate those things quicker. The pictures that Jess showed with the soil berm, that's a pretty newly constructed trail here on one of my districts, and within a year, we had a pretty sizable berm from people using it, compressing the soil. It was a new trail, and the part of the berm that we removed was really for this presentation. We have yet to have the time to go remove the berm off of all 20 plus miles of new trail out there. So we'll talk a little bit more, and I should have talked a little bit more about it at the beginning, but there's that combination of Sidehill trail with that outslope, but also with that undulation. And I always say that the undulation on the trail is your real insurance to make sure that that water never has the chance to get too fast and spend too much time on your tread. But yeah, it's pretty hard to always kind of deal with those problems right as soon as you would like to.
Jess, we've got four more questions in the Q&A box. Do you want to move on and hold those, or do you want to keep going with Q&A?
Let's hold for now, and we will try to get to them at the end. And I'll start looking at the Q&A box to see if I can't answer some of them in typing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about drainage, and I didn't look at the questions, but maybe we'll address some of them with some of our other parts of the presentation. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about drainage. Again, I put this part of the slide together just to, again, remind folks about that kind of that ideal, that rolling contour trail where we're getting that sheeting action. We're not getting water to concentrate. And in a lot of cases, you're going to find a trail that doesn't have this design. And so let's think about drainage and what we can do out there and how we can possibly move whatever trail you're working on closer to that ideal. But we'll kind of review a couple of different types of drainages. Drainage, of course, is there to remove water and sometimes sediment. The speed of the water is dependent on the type of feature that you're building. Some of those examples are water bars, nicks, and rolling grade dips. And so we'll go through a few kind of pluses and minuses and some other things about drainage. So next slide. Yeah, sorry, I hit it again. Cool. So this, oh, sorry. Oh, there you go. So I just wanted to kind of review a couple of interesting different types of drainage features. Here we just have an open culvert. These are usually built in areas where you have a lot of water that crosses the tread, you know, year round or otherwise. You know, you'll have water running through those culverts. You've elevated the trail and then provided a couple of outlets for the water. Some of the work you might do if you came to one of these in terms of maintenance is clearing out those drains. But another thing that you might end up doing, as the arrow indicates, is resetting rocks. As you can see on that one area, those rocks are looking a little loose, and that section of trail, although you can't see too far down it, looks to not be you know, conforming to the other section that you can see. The rocks that have been used to build that part that makes up the majority of the photo, most of those look like they've been pitched. Usually when you're pitching stones, you're pitching them, you're digging a ditch and then you're pitching the stone. I usually use the example of like a gravestone, but you're pitching those stones, you know, a half of that stone depth into the dirt, and creating that box with really good contact and then filling it in with material. But as you can see where that arrow is, you've got a rock that looks to be a bit loose, and it may have not been set right or otherwise. And then so you might end up having to you know, redig that out and pitch those stones correctly, and then fill in the box. Next one, Jess. So here's a turnpike. This is definitely not something that we build a whole lot here in the Southwest. We're starved for water, so not something we have to do much. If you're gonna maintain turnpike, there's a couple of things that you might do. You might clean out the drains on both sides there. You might be either removing, you know, fallen debris or logs, rocks, otherwise just reestablishing any lead-off ditches. And then the other thing you might be doing is digging out those ditches and placing that soil back in the middle of the trail, and convexing that tread so that it sheds water. You might also be doing maintenance on the material that's been used to hold the tread together, whether it's logs or rocks. But that's turnpike, so that would be one of the other styles you might see out there. Next, this is that picture of the Grand Canyon. Again, the water is flowing in instead of out, as the arrows indicate. It's going into that ditch, and then they have these very kind of rudimentary check dams that they've built, which, you know, build. There's, you know, just some rock stacked there, so the water carries the soil to those, hits the rocks, drops the sediment, and so the trail crew is usually in there with round point shovels, just digging the material and then placing it back out on the tread and smoothing it out, and then most likely probably doing a little bit of work on the edge of that trail as well to reinforce that outer edge. Next slide. So this is a very common one. This is something that most folks are all familiar with. And while I was putting this slideshow together, there was an overwhelming amount of information on water bars and how to build water bars, which I'll get on my soapbox here in a second. But anyway, so a water bar is one of those features that may have been built on a trail to remove water. Water bars have a couple of design issues. You can hit the arrow button there, Jess. So water typically, depending on how that water bar is built, of course, it can be built out of rock or logs. A lot of times water bars are not angled correctly to function as they were designed. You'll have water coming down at a high rate of speed. It's carrying sediment. That water hits the rock water bar, drops its sediment, and then finally runs out of the leadoff ditch. A lot of maintenance usually is going to include redigging that area where the sediment's collecting, because if it collects too much, it'll overtake the water bar and then it's absolutely doing nothing. But a lot of times you're digging that out. Another thing that you might do is re-angle the outlet of your water bar so that instead of the water hitting the water bar itself, it actually kind of just keeps its speed and flows through the ditch and out. Again, if it keeps that speed, it's going to take the sediment with it, hopefully. Most likely it'll still back up eventually, but if you re-angle that water bar so that the water doesn't ever stop, that's better for you. However, of course, I'll just point out that by virtue of using a water bar, you are now moving sediment and water off your tread at a high rate of speed. As we talked about a little bit before about trails degrading other resources, one of my main issues with water bars is that they require ongoing maintenance, but that they also are often moving sediment and water possibly into the watershed. So hopefully we can come up with some other alternatives that are a little bit better. But those are kind of some basic things you might be asked to do if you have water bars and you're asked to maintain them. So this box up on the left there is a box that I just cut and pasted out of the Forest Service Trails Maintenance and Construction Handbook. They finally included in there some information about why we're hopefully using water bars less and less. And in this area, they talk about some of the reasons why, but then they also talk about a couple of alternatives to water bars. And they talk about nicks and grade reversals. So the first one is that nick on the left side there. A nick is basically a place where you accentuate that out slope in a certain area of your trail. We talked about a 5% outslope before. In this case, it's a large area that's been accentuated where you have maybe a 15% outslope. Of course, this is something that typically works better on rolling contour trails. You may do this instead of removing. Someone asked about, taking care of problems before they get real bad. Maybe you have a couple miles of trail that all have berm on it, and maybe this is something that you could do in the interim before it gets worse. But that's a nick. I don't tend to find that nicks survive for very long. They're so slight and small that they end up usually forming a berm and not being very useful. The rolling grade dip, this is what someone asked about a little bit before. This is what the Trail Maintenance and Construction Handbook shows for a grade dip. So just hit the button once there. So the rolling grade dip in this diagram is showing that it's a combination of a nick, where the arrow is pointing right now. Go ahead and hit the arrow next. And then we're not dragging the material down off the trail. We're actually using the material from building the nick to then pile up on the downhill side of that nick, so that you have a combination of an outsloped area, but then you've kind of built up an undulation. Again, grade reversals or rolling grade dips, in my experience, are not always super successful. I do like them better than water bars for a number of reasons. I also think they're more user-friendly, but they often don't really make a big change long-term. You can hit the button there. The thing is, even with a rolling grade dip, you've still maintained the same alignment for the trail, and you're really depending on that outsloped nick and that built-up berm to last for very long. And I just have not had the experience where they really do. So the alternative that I would usually advocate for, Justin, you can hit the button, is actually making a change to the alignment of your trail a little bit, and hopefully having undulation in a different way. So I'll kind of introduce this next feature as a great alternative. So I've got the picture there. Just go ahead and hit the first click. So this is what I call a forced uphill undulation, or in the field, we like to call it a FU2. Anyway, this is a forced uphill undulation. Just go ahead and hit the button once. So that red line there, that's the original tread. As you can see, that original tread is a bit ditched out there, and it would have taken a lot of work to build any sort of drainage feature in that spot. to pull all the soil and make it a nick and then try and build a grade reversal would be a lot of work. So instead of doing that, what we did was we actually made what you could consider a very, very small trail relocation. Go ahead and hit the button there, Jess. So you can see that yellow line there. We have now forced users around, and hit the button one more time, Jess. You can see right there at the arrow, you've now introduced an uphill undulation. Jess, you can hit the button one more time. So the nice thing about the forced uphill undulation is that it's not really dependent on features that required heavy construction, and there's really not a whole lot of maintenance that needs to be done in here. Depending on how you design it, the undulation should last for a really long time. This type of thing can work both on a rolling contour trail that may not have sufficient undulation, and it also works on other designs. A couple of things you have to think about is what's the overall grade of the trail I'm working on? If you do some sort of forced uphill undulation, what grade are you now faced with after you've created that? This photo is of a trail in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains. It's not a rolling contour trail. It's basically a trail that follows down a blunt ridge that just had a lot of ditching. So what we're trying to show is that you can do these forced uphill undulations in non-rolling contour trails. And I should also state, especially here in the Southwest, you need to ensure that from your program manager, trail crew leader, your heritage department, et cetera, that you have the corridor to work within. You certainly don't want to be implementing small little bitty relocations like this if it's the fact that you have, heritage resources that are really close within your corridor. But this works really well. The couple of things that you really have to make sure that you do is that you really have a genuine uphill undulation, that it's not so slight. And don't confuse undulation with change in direction. Make sure that the tread is actually going uphill. And the other thing to really, really make sure is that the entry and exit points to your forced uphill undulation are smooth on both sides, that they're not disjointed and at weird turns. And then lastly, I'll just say where the red line is, I took this picture pretty immediately after we had finished this. That old existing trail, you really need to make sure you junk it up quite a bit. You want to make it to the point where the users really have no interest in using it anymore, and that whatever you put in there also is going to really slow water and sediment down to the point where it's no longer an issue. This one, we immediately threw rock in it. We built some very rudimentary stone check dams, and then even farther out, we actually closed it using some brush and stuff we had from another project just down the trail there. But you really got to make it to where the users will not ever want to use that section of trail anymore, that you really focus or force them on that uphill. That's next, Jess. I think that's the end of the drainage. Oop. So questions on that?
Well, we'll start back with the questions that are in the queue. So the first question is, I was hiking on the PCT in Southern Oregon this summer, and part of the trail was built straight through a large lava flow. How would a trail like this be built?
Not having seen the specific trail, I can't say for sure, but I will say that I have built trails through granite slabs and talus fields, and it usually involves explosives to establish some amount of tread, but not always. It really depends on the situation.
Okay, the next one, and I think, Jess, you wanted to answer this one. For trails with long runs of ditching over 100 feet and relatively flat, they fill with water when it rains. Any other tips on how to deal with them?
Yeah, that was actually a case of not understanding how the chat box works, but I can still try to answer that. And I think the next one as well, which also asks about ditching and drainage on trails through flatter terrain. The FU2 that Kerry was just talking about is a potential good solution. in general, if you're in flatter terrain, it's usually soft dirt when you end up with those ditches. And you can put in checks, which is a small structure that slows down water flow and hopefully drops sediment before the water moves on. And that will prevent ditches getting deeper. Hopefully over time, checks bury themselves. Once again, that's something where you're going to want to talk to your trail manager to determine how exactly they want to deal with it, but that's what we typically use, or a combination if we are allowed to do the work on that corridor, a combination of checking in the ditch and doing forced uphill undulations so that you are controlling where the water is flowing and making that unappealing for the user and keeping your tread shedding that water and not increasing the problem.
Yeah, just a couple things I would add to it is, you know, if the trail does the trail absolutely have to be in that really flat terrain? Is there any way that you could possibly move it? And we'll talk a little bit more about those decisions a little farther in the presentation. If you really can't get out of that flatter terrain and it's just deadpan flat, there are a lot of solutions where you actually have to elevate the tread. That's what Turnpike is for. That's what some of those other designs are to deal with. The other question is flat terrain. How flat is it? How flat is the predominant terrain? There's something called the half rule. So, you know, I talked about 8% grade as kind of the higher end of what I usually try and design my trails to. But always understand that if the trail that you're using, if the grade is steeper than half of the overriding terrain, then oftentimes you're going to get water running down that. So again, there's some design things with recontouring or moving the trail here and there. Just minor changes of an elevation can really make a big difference. But yeah, it's very dependent, and flat terrain can be hard to work in for sure. You may have to end up importing material.
Okay, thanks. The next one is, I am sure you will discuss more in the vegetation portion, but I notice veg removal clearance can be drastic, like in the sloughing narrow bike trail. How do you work with veg for erosion control and drainage?
So soft vegetation is good and hard vegetation is bad. So woody, harder vegetation, typically we are pretty aggressive about removing it. And softer, like leafy green vegetation, we leave much closer to our trail tread and leave much more in our corridor. And that soft green stuff will help with erosion control without creating situations typically where your users are trying to move off of your tread to avoid it. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure I actually caught it correctly.
Yeah, if that didn't answer the question, please type in a follow-up if needed. The final question in the Q&A box, is there a steepness above which water bars won't work?
I don't know if there's necessarily a steepness and which water bars won't work. I guess, you know, oftentimes as the terrain gets steeper, the quantity of water bars increases. And again, this is something that Jess and I will discuss here in a little bit. But I would just point out oftentimes that if you're having to utilize a lot of water bars, that's probably an indication that that trail is not designed correctly. It probably needs to be moved. Think about the quantity of water and sediment that you're probably facilitating moving off that trail and what kind of damage it might be doing to other resources in the area. You know, how that does play into the quality of the trail. There are definitely steepnesses where water bars or any of the other drainage features that we have prescribed really don't work. And really the only thing you're going to end up doing is being able to build like a staircase. And that may or may not be friendly for the use type that's allowed on that trail. So what I would say is before you prescribe a water bar to an area, think about maybe some other options, because the water bars really are a pretty undesirable feature these days. And you know, if you have questions about other options, there should be, you know, a good resource to maybe help you prescribe something different.
And just in case that question was about relatively perpendicular water bars versus making them steeper so that the water runs more directly off the trail, that's the ideal steepness is 45 to 60 degrees versus your tread. And it's mostly a practicality issue. If you're going more than 60 degrees, that thing's going to be really long and just not worth the investment. 60 seems to, generally speaking, do the job. Okay, I'm going to keep going in the interest of keeping on time.
Yeah, that's it. Go ahead. Thank you.
So next up, we'll talk a little bit about corridor. And I will follow the same format as last time. I will go over the most common corridor tools that I have seen and known, kind of a definition of what exactly is corridor, and then the two most common corridor activities, which are brushing and logging. So brushing tools, once again, ones that have existed on districts that I've worked on, but not on all of them. You may or may not see some of these. There are weed cutters and brush hooks. Both are designed for standing and swinging around your foot level. There's the Swedish brush saw or Swedish brush axe, which is kind of designed for woodier material. It's a shorter handle. There are machetes and woodsman's pals. I haven't ever actually used one, but I've seen them on districts. They require a lot of honing. And then there's the most common tool that you're going to see is the heavy duty lopping shears or loppers. We use them a lot. We also use the folding pruning saw, which is on the top right here. That kind of serves both functions. It is a brushing tool and a logging tool. There are also the fixed blade pruning saws, often a D handle. Most of the time, both the folding and fixed blades are pull only saws, so they do their cutting action on the pull. Going across the top here, we also have the bow saw. They've gone slightly out of favor, but they're still actually a good and efficient tool. They're just a little bit more difficult to use and carry for the inexperienced. Axes, both single bit and double bit, are valuable. Single bits particularly, they have their place. And then there's the crosscut saw, and we have the bucking saw example on the bottom right here, and the asymmetric, also known as single buck, on the bottom left. That can be operated either by one person or by two people, which makes them kind of nice. The little handle on the end can be moved closer to the D handle to make a more efficient single sawyer saw. So all things that you might see wherever you're working. And then of course, there's also power tools, but because this is a Wilderness Skills Institute, I will not go into great detail on those. So what is corridor? Corridor is the space around the tread of the trail that we try to keep clear of vegetation so that users stay on the trail. You have to remember, not every trail was necessarily designed, but in general, at this point, we have decided where we want people to be walking or stalk or what have you. And our goal is to keep them there. And if vegetation is allowed to grow into that space, it will start to push users out of it. So we would like to make that space nice and appealing to our users. Commonly, not universally, but commonly in a wilderness setting, they are pack and saddle trails. And typically, you'll notice I'm using a lot of modifiers here. Typically, pack and saddle trails are roughly 8 to 10 feet wide corridor and 10 to 12 foot tall corridor. And you can roughly approximate that as an individual standing, holding a axe or a Pulaski. And if you have your arms fully outstretched to the side and add a foot on either side of them, that is the width of your corridor. And if you hold your hand tool above your head, fully extended, that is your height. So it's an easy rule of thumb for pack and saddle trails for establishing what corridor is. But once again, it's not the same everywhere. So we'll talk about X feet wide and Y feet tall. That's hard to say. And when you stare at a trail, there should be this relatively clear box. That is your corridor. That is your doorway through which people are invited to walk. And so in this case, the log that was cut out of this trail was not actually moved out of the corridor. So if you were doing maintenance on this trail, you would want to move that log so that the users are not deviating off to the right, trying to avoid it, and thus widening your tread. And then we've got a couple of other examples of what corridor looks like. You can see, obviously the trail's getting farther away, so it's not perfect, but you can see we generally keep that open area. And in response to that earlier question, we're keeping it free of woody material. A little bit of fern here or there is not going to be the end of the world. It will help us with preventing mass erosion. But we want to make sure that it is plenty clear enough for people to comfortably walk through. And here's another example in another place. And you'll notice you can see the logs that were cut off to the right of the screen. And they were cut nice and wide so that we're maintaining that corridor. So brushing in the corridor looks different in different places. There are places like on the left here where the brush is heavy and it is slow moving and it takes many people all working together, cutting it out of the way. There are places like the middle where the brush is lighter. It is less of a thing and people get spread out, just brushing as they go. And then there are places where we can use chainsaws, as you can see in the top right. The same things exist there too, right? Vegetation changes depending on where you are. I just wanted to express different tools doing the jobs. And you can see he's doing a good job with the chainsaw of cutting that tree very close to the ground. And when we're talking about brushing, we're talking about removing anything that is within that trail corridor, whether it's baby trees or alder or any other brush or limbs. In terms of brushing best practices, we like to cut limbs and branching stems off at joints. So limbs will be cut at the bole of a tree and branching stems are cut at the branch. And then if you are removing an entire piece of vegetation, you cut it off at the ground and flush with the ground. So at the same angle. We don't like to leave pointy things that become stobs or stabbers. And then we also want to consider that if you are cutting more than half of the vegetation off of a plant, you probably want to remove the entire plant. We don't like popsicle trees or half trees, tree on one side and not on the other. You are doing a disservice to the plant. Other things will grow nearby. Get rid of it. So hopefully this video works. This is an example from my district in the past year. These are taken in the same piece of trail.
Before. After.
That's my favorite part. It's pretty impressive what a difference a little bit of time spent cutting brush can make. This was a really difficult to travel piece of trail, and with some really devoted time spent to brushing, and it's not actually that much time, they were able to make it so that you could see the tread again. You can see the wildlife, the surroundings, you can travel without things grabbing your backpack. It's amazing what brushing can do for you. Oh, geez. Good. So logging. Logging is also a thing. Boy, we're running out of time. We cut plants, or we cut logs off of trails. We can do it in a bunch of different ways: chainsaw, crosscut saw, axe, or handsaw. we'll skip this, but I can possibly share it afterwards. This is the protocols that I give to my people for how and where to cut logs. The important thing to remember is that there is a lot of thought that goes into where you cut logs to keep users where you want them on the trail. So we've got a couple of before and after pictures. It can be simple or it can be complicated. In this case, they actually made very few cuts on the logs themselves. It was mostly cleaning up material and branches coming off of them. However, it was super important that they do that to keep users on the trail instead of pushing up to the right. And another common issue is cutbacks. You can see here, if you compare our person hiking on the trail to that image, this is a pack and saddle trail, and this was clearly not cut wide enough. And same thing with on the ground here, that big log is in the corridor and pushing the user uphill. So sometimes you have to go back and cut more logs and cut logs a second time. Ideally, you are being thoughtful enough about your logging and you know your standards from your trail manager so that this does not become an issue. And I'm going to skip questions and send it back to Kerry.
All right, well, this is really convenient that I didn't make the structures talk too long because we're running out of time. Structures are typically the more sexy things in trail work. Everybody wants to build structures. Really, hopefully, we don't have to build too many of these in a lot of places. And I'll put in my plug for wilderness. I often find if you're having to build a lot of structures, you're actually moving your trail away from a primitive, a primitive looking trail. The more features, more structures you're building, the less it looks like, maybe a trail that you want to have in your wilderness area. But anyway, we'll talk about a few structures here. So the first is a rock retaining wall or a crib wall. Some of the things that you might be looking at when you're looking at a retaining wall is the batter, as indicated in that red triangle that just showed up there. So that batter is basically that angle that the wall moves back. Depending on the height, depending on a number of factors, that batter needs to be a certain degree in order for it to be a stable structure. If you're finding crib walls that are failing, in some cases, it's because the wall wasn't built with much of a batter, and that pressure off of the tread is really pushing that wall out or some other thing. Another thing to look at, you can't see it too well in the presentation, is making sure that joints have been broken, or there's original construction is that you've broke joints when you've laid your stone. You don't want a joint that follows from the bottom all the way to the top of your wall. A lot of times you'll find weaknesses in a crib wall where joints haven't been broken. So when you do go back to rebuild a crib or retaining wall, that's something that you really need to make sure you're paying attention to, that you break your joints as you restack the rock. And third, you can hit the click there, Jess. The other one that we find pretty often here in the Southwest is that capstone. Typically, we find a lot of times when these have been built, sometimes they used all the really good rocks down at the bottom. And as they got towards the top, they looked around and thought, oh man, we don't have any big rocks anymore for the capstone. So a lot of times that top course of our wall ends up being made of stone that's just not sufficient to really hold it there. And it gets kicked off or somehow gets removed. And then you've got all of your backfill, which is possibly starting to find its way out. So that's probably one of the more frequent repair things that we do when we're rebuilding retaining walls, is that we're having to reset capstones. Usually what you end up having to do is dig out your backfill, move it to another location, reset all your capstones, and then bring that backfill in. And certainly something to just think about is those outside forces and the use types. As I think Jess mentioned, or we've mentioned before, pack stock often likes to kind of move to the outside edge. So hopefully the outer part of your wall isn't just all small capstones. Hopefully maybe you can also include some bigger ones, so the pack stock stay over in the middle. But that's just retaining and crib walls. There's all kinds of stuff. It's such an art. There are all kinds of workshops you can get involved with all over the country that teach building walls. That's just a quick overview and some of the repair. I really liked this monstrosity on the North Kaibab Trail in the Grand Canyon. Is really cool, and it must have just taken so much work. So we have a combination of log steps, some stone paving, log cribbing, all kinds of stuff going on here. I certainly know from my days on the Appalachian Trail, we built a lot of log and stone staircases. This is oftentimes the kind of work that a lot of volunteers just really find fun and engaging. They like to do this, maybe except for the moving of the material over to the project area. That's not always as much fun, unless you're using a grip hoist. There are all varieties of ways to build these. The one thing that I will put as a comment for steps is that middle model that's shown in that diagram on the right. If you are working on a trail that steps are appropriate, and you're working on a section of trail that's steep, and you prescribe to put individual steps spaced evenly apart, I would often recommend that instead of doing that, I often like to build steps somewhat in pairs or threes. And the reason I like to do that is because I want to try and get closer to that model that we were talking about of sustainability with undulation. If you can rise a little bit more, you might be able to extend your run long enough to slow water down. But oftentimes I'll see log or rock steps built spaced evenly on a long stretch of steep trail, and the water's just running straight down them at a very high rate of speed and undercutting them. So if you do have the choice, like I said, I like to build steps in pairs or threes enough to where I can, oh, time, Bill is saying. So that's steps. What's the next one? Oh, steps. Bill, do you want to jump in? Do we need to cut it?
Yeah, I apologize.